Kisses from Cuba presents Mountain Girl, a story of Cuban isolation by Charles Boesen. Mountain Girl, whose name I never learned, sat next to her grandpa on the edge of a small daybed, and she used a spoon to shave slivers of frozen red juice from a battered tin cup. She would eat a shaving of the frozen liquid, and then she'd scrape another for her grandpa and playfully feed him. Although he was conversing with my Cuban friend and taxi driver Miguel, the grandfather would patiently accept a spoonful when his young granddaughter offered. His face was kind, his gaze toward her loving. I sat quietly on one of the only two chairs in the home. I had not spoken since arriving because 1. I didn't speak Spanish well, and 2. I simply wanted to watch that remarkably humble scene unfold. I wondered if the little girl was aware that her family had few possessions and that she lived in bone-crushing poverty. It appeared to me that the only luxuries she had at the moment were our company and that frozen juice in her cup, and she was happily sharing it. 3 generations lived under that tiny roof: Mountain Girl, who looked to be about 9, her parents, and her grandparents. The shack, constructed of rough-hewn wooden planks, had no interior walls, and was no larger than my single-car garage back in the States. From where I sat, I could see every square inch of the interior, including the sunlight that easily found its way through the gaps. The only furniture in Mountain Girl's home, besides the daybed and the wooden chairs, were 2 twin beds and a small wooden table. As for appliances, there was a refrigerator, a single hot plate, and a sewing machine. I also noted a solitary iron pipe with a water spigot mounted on the wall. There was little else in that home. No radio, TV, phone, or bathroom. I didn't see a food pantry, nor in fact did I see any food. I couldn't help but wonder, how do these people manage? And how did they have their private, intimate moments? What struck me most, considering the circumstances, was that they appeared content and happy. I had traveled to Cuba surreptitiously, ignoring the 50-year-old travel and trade embargo we Americans have against them. Miguel, my bilingual guide, had driven us several hours into the mountains to reach this family. Mountain Girl's grandpa was a friend of Miguel, and Miguel understood that he had access to a rowboat, a rarity in Cuba. I wanted to fish during my stay on the island, and we hoped Mountain Girl's grandpa could help. Thinking back, I have to smile. An American fishing in the Cuban countryside was another rarity. Since Mountain Girl's family didn't have a phone, our appearance at their door was unexpected, but welcomed, which is customary in Cuba. Customary, Miguel later informed me, because a good communist has nothing to hide and unexpected guests should be expected. Soon after our arrival, the grandmother promptly began to prepare the traditional café cubano, coffee with sugar. Guests in a Cuban home are always invited to share Cuban coffee, which is strong, thick, and black, more like tar of caffeine. The thick stuff is served in tacitas, or tiny cups, with nearly equal amounts of raw Cuban sugar. The extreme amount of sweetener, I believe, is to trick your throat's gag reflexes, so you don't spew the bitter goo all over your neighbor. As Grandma served coffee, Miguel and Grandpa continued to converse, while Mountain Girl's parents sat patiently quiet on a twin bed behind me. I too continued to sit quietly in my small wooden chair as I slowly sipped my coffee. Mountain Girl was now talking to her grandpa, in Spanish of course, while she continued to feed him slivers of flavored ice. She didn't seem to expect him to respond. He was, after all, speaking to Miguel. But she chirped away regardless in her melodious voice. Chirp, chirp, chirp went her Spanish words. She had an angelic face with beautiful brown eyes, and her shiny dark hair was pulled back tight into a ponytail. Her skin of cinnamon had just a hint of rose from a slight sunburn. Chirp, 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 she sang. Once finished with my atomic strength coffee, I spoke for the first time, in English, to Miguel. So, do we have a plan for fishing tomorrow morning? Suddenly, Mountain Girl went quiet. all chirping stopped. At the moment that I spoke, she dropped her hand holding the cup of frozen juice into her lap, and her jaw went slack. Miguel answered me in English, and we continued to converse about possible fishing plans. All the while, however, I could see in my peripheral vision that Mountain Girl was staring at me. She could not or would not look away. She didn't scrape the ice. She didn't chirp. She didn't move. She simply sat there, stone still. I turned and smiled at her, and when I did, her head and shoulders made a small but discernible movement backward and toward her grandpa. "Hello," I said in English. Mountain Girl gently cuffed her grandpa's arm and pulled herself tight against him, pressing her cheek to his bicep. She didn't respond to me in kind. Her eyes flicked up, and she looked over my shoulder to her parents, who sat behind me on the bed. Mountain Girl may have wanted to see if they too were alarmed, but apparently she didn't detect any concern because she settled her gaze back on me. So there we were, Mountain Girl and I, having an awkward moment. Why had she reacted so? Had she assumed I was Cuban? Had she never heard English before? Miguel was then speaking to her in Spanish, and I caught the words Americano and Inglés, or American man and English, and my suspicions were confirmed. For all of her 9 or so years, Mountain Girl had heard only Spanish until the day I arrived, nor had she ever met an American. Knowing that Mountain Girl was trying to process what had just happened, Miguel's conversation with her gave me time to reflect and to figure out what my next move was going to be. I felt bad that she was upset, and it was no secret that she, along with her Cuban classmates, had been taught to distrust and fear Americans. And there she was, sitting nearly knee to knee with the enemy. And little did she know that I, too, as a young boy in snowy white Minnesota, was taught to distrust and fear a group of people. Her people. Miguel finished speaking to Mountain Girl, and her eyes moved to me. It was my turn, and I had arrived at a plan. While traveling Cuba, I regularly carried gifts for both adults and children. So I requested that Miguel ask her parents if I could give her a gift. He did, and they gave their approval. And since Mountain Girl clearly understood that exchange between Miguel and her parents, she leaned slightly forward and away from the safety of her grandpa. She watched as I bent over, opened my backpack, and dug down for a gift that I understood no young girl anywhere in the world could resist. A tube of Hannah Montana lip gloss. It had sparkles in it. You could see them floating in the liquid through the clear tube. I held it out in front of me and toward her. Her reaction was immediate. Her expression was pure little girl joy. She moved, or more accurately, floated off of the daybed and toward me, reaching out and taking the tube of lip gloss. "Gracias," she said. "De nada," or "You're welcome," I answered. She stood there in front of me, transfixed on the lip gloss in her hand, knowing that she held something so unique that she could not imagine another mountain girl possessing the same. I knew from my experiences in Cuba that Mountain Girl would make that lip gloss last many times longer than designed, never putting too much on, never wasting it. She would sleep with it, and she'd bring classmates home to look at it, then tuck it safely away when they left. And when the tube did run dry, she'd never dispose of the glass container. Mountain Girl moved behind me, closer to her parents and out of the spotlight. I imagined she was overwhelmed and needed the safe sanctuary of her mother. Miguel and I resumed discussing our fishing plans with her grandfather. Grandpa offered to take us to a nearby lake the following morning. There a rowboat would be waiting, and he would row us on a lake named Lago Anabanilla, as I fished for the day. We agreed on $25 compensation for his time and effort. That amount seemed insufficient to me, but understood it was nearly a month's wages in Cuba. The energy in the house had thankfully calmed, and Mountain Girl appeared more relaxed. It seemed she had somewhat adapted to the fact that there was an American in her house, but I was confident she had additional questions for her parents. She would have to rethink what she had learned about the evil capitalist monsters, the Americans, and it was now humorous to see her head spin each time I spoke. As Miguel and I prepared to end our visit that afternoon, I offered, since I'm a professional photographer, to take a family photo of everyone, along with an individual photo of Mountain Girl. They all agreed, and there was sudden excitement in the air. It was picture time. Mountain Girl and her mother hurriedly went outside to the outdoor latrine to freshen Mountain Girl up for her photo. Her mother washed her face, recombed her hair, and put small hoop earrings into her ears. Mountain Girl then retrieved her most prized possession, a plastic doll dating from the 1950s that most likely was manufactured in the United States. Her grandmother had recycled the doll and refashioned it with a cloth body. Mountain Girl sat proudly with her doll on the edge of the daybed and posed for her portrait. I could see through my lens that she was more comfortable, even trusting of my gesture. I said smile in English out of habit, and she smiled. I snapped her portrait. Moments later, the whole family, including their friend Miguel, posed in the tiny yard for a group photo. Miguel and I said goodbye to the family and told Mountain Girl's grandpa that we'd return at 5 the next morning for our fishing adventure. But before we left, I promised Mountain Girl, with Miguel translating, that I would deliver her finished photo to her the next day. I had a portable 4x6 photo printer back at my rented casa, which I'd brought with me from the States just for this kind of situation. The following morning, it was still dark when Miguel and I arrived in front of Mountain Girl's grandpa's house to retrieve him for our day of fishing. We didn't go up to the door. We planned on visiting the family after our fishing adventure. Her grandfather came out and greeted us as we sat waiting for him in the car. He said something to Miguel, and Miguel translated for me. Is it possible for him to bring the photos into the house and give them to his granddaughter? She was so excited to get the finished photos that she didn't sleep during the night. I pulled the 2 prints from my backpack and handed them to Mountain Girl's grandpa. Muchas gracias, he said, and hurried into his home with the photos. After our day of fishing and back at Mountain Girl's humble home, her grandmother again prepared Café Cubano for all of the adults. The whole family was there except Mountain Girl's father. He was notably absent. He had left the house earlier by choice, I later learned, knowing I was returning. He was a member of the Cuban military, and the culture gap between us was apparently too wide for him to bridge, and that was a choice I respected. As the adults sipped their coffee, Mountain Girl sat next to her grandpa eating her frozen juice, and on the bed next to her was her doll, her lip gloss, and the photo of her. Thankfully, she was again chirping, but her tone was different, perhaps slightly more mature, and her head no longer spun when I spoke. Was it possible my visit facilitated a shift? Finally, it was time for me to leave and head back to the Caribbean coast to my rented casa, but not before the group made me promise to visit on my next trip to Cuba. All of us then gathered outside near Miguel's taxi, and we said our goodbyes. Just before I got into the taxi, Mountain Girl pushed her way forward, stood next to me, and said something to me in Spanish. I looked at Miguel, and he said, "She wants to give you a kiss." So there we were, Mountain Girl and I, having a moment. Our moment of reconciliation. Perhaps she now viewed the world and me a little different. And maybe she'll smile knowingly with sparkly lips when her school teachers refer to the Americanos in their lessons. And for me, I'm looking forward to introducing my own granddaughter to a darling little communist that lives in the Cuban mountains. I leaned down, and she kissed me on my cheek and softly chirped "Gracias" into my ear. "Igualmente," or "the same to you," I answered. Moments later, Miguel put the car into gear and we rolled away. I thought about my experience with Mountain Girl, her humble life, and how grateful I was to have met her. A short distance down the road, local children played near the edge, and Miguel slowed as we passed. One little boy stopped what he was doing and waved, the low Cuban sun making his dark skin gold. "Hello," I said, out the window. He wrinkled his nose and squinted. I then yelled, "Hola!" "Hola!" he sang back, and began to chase the car in a swirl of dust. I turned and watched as he, along with Mountain Girl's home, faded into a golden cloud of isolation.